We'll be talking to you about a really awesome Enduro EMTB, the Giant Rain Pro 2, a bike that our team has had a lot of fun getting to know the ins and outs of with its excellent Yamaha motor. However, there are still many test results to discuss and things to geek out over, so let's dive into everything in this review. Hey everybody, I'm Griffin and welcome to Electric Bike Report, your #1 source of all things e-bike. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can keep up with each bike that goes into our testing database, because we have videos coming out multiple times a week. Now, today's review is a little different. This review is of a slightly older bike. This is the Giant Rain E+ Pro 2, and this particular model came out in 2022. So why are we looking at an older bike? Well, there have been some changes between it and the current gen models, but we're still looking at the same motor and frame and many of the same components. The benefit of the one that we're riding on is it's going to cost a fraction of the price. Current gen Rains are going between $6,000 and $7,000, but this one is going for closer to half that price. But for right now, let's focus on the Rain. This is a great enduro bike with the geo necessary for seriously fun trips downhill and a suspension system that soaks up some of the chunkiest trails we have here in southern Utah. It also has a terrific Yamaha PWX3 motor, which after riding it a lot over the last several weeks, makes us feel like Yamaha's name should come up more often when discussing the hierarchy of great e-bike motors. But first, let's walk through everything on the bike, but just remember some things can change depending on the size of the model you find. Ours was a large. So this is an aluminum frame and it's available in 4 different sizes. Our test bike weighed in at 56 pounds. This bike has a flip chip setup, so you can alter some of the geometry slightly to tune it to your preference. We actually did appreciate making the head tube a little steeper when we went from some of the more downhill friendly rides to tighter switchback filled ones. Our bike's head tube angle is 63.7 to 64.5 degrees, and the seat tube angle is 76.7 to 77.5 degrees. The reach is 475 to 480 millimeters, while the stack is 645 to 641 mil. The suspension is 160/170. The fork is the RockShox Zeb, and the rear shock is the Fox Float X, which integrates into Giant's Maestro suspension linkage. It was overall a really nice ride that we'll get into finer details on in just a bit. The drivetrain is a 12-speed SRAM Eagle GX group set. It has a 36-tooth chainring with a 10 to 50-tooth rear cassette. Spinning the drivetrain is a pair of Praxis 165mm cranks. The wheels are Giant's own AM mix set with E-Tracker boost hubs and are rolling on Maxxis tires with a 29 by 2.6 inch Maxxis Minion DHF up front and a 27.5 by 2.5 inch high roller in the rear. Now stopping the bike are SRAM Code R hydraulic brakes with a massive python of a rotor. It's 220mm up front and 200mm in the rear. The saddle is a Giant Romero Trail on a Giant Switch dropper post, which has 170mm of travel on our large frame. The handlebar is Giant's Contact Trail Bar, which is 800mm in width, with the Tactical Pro lock-on grips on either side. Really, this is a lot of bike, that's a lot of good components, and the preview of what to come is they all mesh nicely, but again, because this is a little bit older, it is phenomenal value since you can get it all in the $3,000 to $4,000 price range. The electrical system of the Giant Rain is good and, dare I say, underrated. The Rain's motor is the Yamaha PWX3 motor with custom tuning by Giant with what they call sync drive technology. It is a 250 watt nominal and 500 max watt motor with a nice 85 newton meters of torque. At 6.06 pounds, it gives you an 82.5 watts per pound power to weight ratio, which is pretty solid. Yamaha designed it to output between 80 and 400% assistance, which we found to be very natural and powerful on the trails. It is very useful, especially when starting out. It has more power than most when pedaling at lower cadence. Now, what's the benefit of that? Well, if you've slowed down a bit coming out of a corner and you're going straight into a hill, you'll find it has a really good amount of push when starting the climb. It always helps to be in the appropriate gear, but it feels like this one is even a bit more forgiving since you don't need a higher cadence to access higher power levels from the motor. It just starts with more. Now, by contrast, it feels a little less powerful than other motors do when pedaling at higher cadence or as you progress through a longer climb. It took a little practice to get the right gear because of this, but overall, I still thought of it as a great climber once I learned how the motor worked. We'll get to the hill test data soon, but in some ways the data doesn't tell the story of this motor. Every one of us really liked the natural feel of the motor on every trail we took it on. It does have some noise and whine to it, but overall we came away very impressed with what Giant has done with Yamaha here. And I think that Yamaha deserves to be talked about more in the EMTB space. The motor has 5 different power levels, each felt fairly distinct from the others without making any adjustments, but there is an app where you can tailor each level's power output, which I'm going to detail that a little bit later on. One quirk of the setup we noticed was what I describe as its twitchiness. You notice it the most when track standing or if you push down on the pedals when you stop to rest on the side of the road or just check your phone. Any pressure on the pedals at all and you sense the motor really wants to engage. It's almost like a vibration when doing a track stand or a bit lurchy when at a standstill. Now, if this sounds like a big deal, it's really not. It will take some time to get used to, and you can actually play with the programming to eliminate it entirely, so it's just something to be aware of when you are starting out. Now, one of the few true issues we had with the whole system came down to the PAS controls. This is not our favorite interface, as the buttons were a little hard to hit accurately when on the fly. I sometimes hit the middle one or hit up when I meant to hit down. It's hard to distinguish without looking and especially difficult in gloves, so we'd welcome a different control panel with more distinct buttons. On the battery side of things, there are a few different sizes offered on Giant Rain models. For this 2022 model, the 625 watt-hour battery comes standard. There is a 750 watt-hour battery as well, and current gen Rains are actually starting with a massive 800 watt-hour battery. Obviously, be aware of your own battery needs, as bigger isn't always better since there is a weight penalty, but if you're looking to maximize your ride time and take longer trips, then it's nice to know there are options in sizes. The Rain has a fairly simplistic interface. There are LED light indicator buttons along the top tube that'll let you know what power level you're in and the remaining battery life. This is one of those systems meant to stay out of your way, but easy to understand when you glance at it. The bike does have an app that you can connect with, the Giant Ride Control app. Here is where you can change up how the bike operates at different PAS settings. There are 3 different outputs you can tailor to your liking across each of the 5 PAS levels. There's the support, which affects total power that you receive. We personally felt eco mode could be increased here. Then there's torque, which is what will really shine in terms of how it performs on hills. Finally, there is launch. We mentioned the aggressive feeling when you are track standing or putting any pressure on the pedals, and here's where you can control that. If you lower the launch, it will reduce or eliminate that, with the trade-off of feeling a bit slower in those low cadence settings. We actually didn't change this from the factory settings once we got used to it, but you can tone it down if it isn't for you. The app also lets you change the controls of the physical PAS buttons. You can program each button and assign it to increase your PAS level, engage walk assist, or smart assist mode. If you're doing something a bit more mellow and cross-country, you can use your phone as a display too and get more information such as distance and battery. There is a trip planner and GPS, and you can even sync this to your Strava account. There's also a quick diagnostic you can run in the settings, which will check the electric systems are all running properly, which might be wise to do before starting a longer ride. I mean, overall, it's a pretty easy to use system. I did have a few connectivity issues for the first few days, something I've seen others online discuss having encountered before, but I was finally able to get it to work. It's also able to do OTA updates to get you on the latest firmware. Really, the functionality here and the ability to tailor your PAS settings is always nice to have, and the app is similar to what many other motors are including these days, so it's just nice to have. You also don't have to use the app on every ride. You can just hop on your bike and go if you want, but I think getting the app for the initial setup and for any motor updates is a good idea. So as we've been building up our EMTB database, we've mainly been citing one range test that we do on max power. Truthfully, our course can be a bit difficult if you're attempting to only ride in eco the whole time, but we had a little extra time on this one, so today you'll be getting both the eco and power mode results for a floor and ceiling value on battery life. So with factory eco settings, we were able to go 56 miles in a time of about 5.5 hours while climbing 5,888 feet in elevation gained. Not bad at all in terms of total mileage, but we did feel like eco mode left us wanting for a little more power. We left the eco setting as it comes out of the box. I would personally adjust the eco setting to be just a little bit more powerful, but if you want eco to basically just take the weight off the bike and pedal as a normal bike, well, you can probably not change that setting. With the default max setting, which is called power, our tester got 23.5 miles in just under 2 hours of ride time with 2,434 feet climbed. Overall, that's a good and practical range and solid efficiency from a 625 watt-hour battery. If you need tons of assistance, I'm always hoping for about 25 miles worth of range from an EMTB, and it's in that ballpark. If you haven't been to our channel before, then let me officially welcome you to our famous hill tests. For EMTBs, that means 2 different test hills. First at Hellhole Trail, where we test each and every e-bike we get in, from cargo bikes to beach cruisers. It is 1/3 of a mile long with a 12% average grade. And then, since you won't buy a bike like the Rain for riding on paved paths, we take EMTBs out to our water tower climb. It's just under a mile long and it has a 5.5% grade. Now our tester Justin did both of these tests, so I'll pass it to him so you can see how the bike did.
All right, we're out here doing the Hellhole test on the giant Rain, and we're gonna see how this motor does. It's kind of built with conjunction with Yamaha. Feels very natural on the trail. Tons of fun. So we'll see. I don't have a screen with the speed or anything. From a noise perspective, let you listen to it here. You can hear it a little bit, but it's not bad at all. So I'll let you listen here. Morning. So definitely as my cadence picks up here more, yeah, just like on the other testing I've done, so it feels very natural and smooth. We'll see. I will say it doesn't quite feel as punchy as some of the other motors, and again, it's more on the natural smooth side. I think it'll be pretty good though. Feels very dialed in, and yeah, we'll see how this compares against some of the other motors here. All right, we are out doing the water tower hill test on the giant Rain E. Now this is a used model from the Pros Closet, as we mentioned, and so it's kind of a cool test in that it's not a brand new motor. It's the motor that Giant did with Yamaha, and I've been curious to see how it does. So we're gonna climb up to the top here. I'm gonna keep my cadence and output, right about where I try to be consistent on all the bikes. But we'll climb for a minute, and then I'll come back with some of my thoughts. So let's do it. Okay, so far I will say I mean, it's pretty windy. Motor's fairly quiet. When I get the cadence higher, then I do hear a little bit more. I'm not sure if you were able to hear it or not because the wind. It seems to be doing decently when I don't have the cadence exactly right, like in the lower cadence. So it's gonna be decent output. And I will say that it feels very natural. It doesn't feel, I don't know, it's just a very natural feeling. Really curious to see kind of how it does on the results. But it does feel powerful, it feels peppy. It's always hard for me to say it on the fly, how it compares to other motors, so I'll hold that back. But the one thing that I will just again highlight is it just feels natural and nice on that assist. I do think I get a little bit more if I shift into a higher gear, or a lower gear, excuse me, in higher cadence. But it still does well overall. So yeah, we'll go to the tape, check this out, then come back with our analysis.
At Hellhole, the rain posted a time around our current average of all the bikes we've tested there. It ascended the hill in 1 minute and 27 seconds with a 12.5 mile per hour average. The current average time for bikes stands at 1 minute and 29 seconds. On the water tower climb, it made it to the top in 4 minutes and 1 second. That comes out to an average pace of 12.9 miles per hour. Now that's a little bit slower than other bikes, as we're currently averaging 3 minutes and 43 seconds there. Now, I think this is a pretty solid result, and there are a few things worth diving into. For one, you saw on Hellhole that it was able to hang with most other bikes just fine. It's got pretty good power to it. On the water tower climb, it was a little slower than others. Now, as I mentioned before, the motor is powerful, but did feel slightly less powerful than some of the other motors we've tested out there. Just keep in mind that you'll notice this more on long, drawn-out climbs up double-track roads. On the trail, I don't think you're gonna notice it much at all. You still get to the top pretty easily, and enduro bikes are more for downhill anyway, so the fact that the motor can take the slog out of climbing and make it enjoyable is a pretty big win. Overall, we think it's just a sound system, especially if you're coming over from an analog mountain bike now, or if you just appreciate the fact that you can now ride up something instead of having to take a tram on an enduro ride.
Hey guys, welcome to the ride quality portion of our review today. We are on the Giant Rain E Plus. Normally, we take you guys on the southern Utah trails that we test our bikes on and kind of talk about how the bike performs on the variety of terrain that's there, and that is going to be rocky and technical, as well as some smooth and flowy with different types of climbing and descending mixed in. But today we got something a little different. We're up here in the mountains of southern Utah. We're going to be riding a trail that is normally a shuttle trail, a shuttle downhill trail, but there is a loop that you can ride up the road if you want to. So today we're going to be riding the road up, taking some single track across the mountain crest, and then heading down. So normally, you know, when we do our ride quality portion, we like to talk about 3 main components of the bike that contribute to the overall ride quality. The first component being the motor. The second component is going to be the bike frame, manufacturer, how they've designed it. And then the third component is the components. So your shock, fork, drivetrain, brakes, you know, that type of stuff. Just to see how they perform. So first, let's get into the motor. This bike is sporting the Yamaha PWX3 motor, which in this latest iteration of the motor has been increased in power and decreased in size and decreased in weight. First off, the thing that I love about this motor is the fact that it makes no noise, no rattle. It's like, unlike the Bosch motors, Shimano motors, there is Bafang also, that motor has some rattle and some noise, but this one is dead silent, which you don't really notice how quiet it is until you've ridden something else that just rattles around while you're riding. So that's a plus in my book with this motor. You know, the other part of this motor is, you know, as far as sound goes, is when you're pedaling and how much noise does it make. And I would say it is significantly quieter than all those motors I just mentioned, your Bosch, Shimano, Bafang. I would say it's just a little bit louder than the Brose motor, or Brose motor, that's in a few bikes. The new gas mountain bike has that, e-mountain bike, and that's also the motor that Specialized uses in their Levo. The more I've ridden this bike, the more the sound, it's very comparable to one of the motors that's now become very popular among the mid-powered lightweight e-bikes, or EMTBs, and that's the Fazua motor. Significantly smaller, significantly lighter weight, and significantly lower powered than this Yamaha motor. But the noise is very similar, and it's so nice because when you get out, if you're not, you know, got your headphones in, or if you're not talking, you're just out for the ride, enjoying the trails and the scenery and nature, the motor can sometimes detract from that quality of ride that you get on the trail. This motor absolutely does not. It's very quiet. So moving on, power wise, okay, so the power of this motor on paper is 85 newton meters of torque, which is right on par with most other full power EMTB motors. But one of the unique things about this motor that I found is that it gives you a very substantial amount of torque and power in lower cadences that a lot of the other motors seem to trail off on. So, you know, in that 40 to 70 cadence range, the motor still does pull really well. On the flip side, with that lower cadence preference on this bike, when you do get into those higher cadences, 80, 90 and above, it doesn't give you much, which is something I think that as a rider who's used to more of the higher cadences, I had to get used to. But once I got used to it, you know, it's like anything else, it works great. Just gotta make sure you're shifting at the right times. Whereas in some other motors, you can kind of rely more on your cadence to get you through things. So that's how, as far as power goes on this motor, it seems to be a little bit lower powered, at least as far as how it feels. Again, on paper it's very similar, but it seems to be give you a little less power than the Bosch motors, the Bosch CX specifically, and then a little bit better than the Shimano motors. I don't know how it really compares to Bafang, but I would say probably just a little lower. The Bafang motors we've tested are a little bit higher Newton meter ratings. This motor has 5 power settings, and normally I would say you don't really need that. You don't need that many power settings. However, with this bike, or excuse me, with this motor, like a lot of other motors, they do have an app that you can connect to and customize the settings. But I find that the app on the Yamaha motor isn't as user-friendly as the other apps that are out there. So I actually like the fact that it's got 5 power settings, because you can dial in the type of power you want just as good with those 5 power settings as you could with your with the app on the other motors. So as we're making our way up this boring fire road, sorry guys, I'm just usually not a fan of riding up a fire road, but I will say that on an e-bike it makes it pretty nice. And for the descent that we're going to get to, it's definitely worth it. You hear a lot of people talk about different types of climbs and the descents associated with those climbs, and is the juice worth, or is the squeeze worth the juice per se? And there's not a lot of climbs on an e-bike that at least that I found that the juice is not worth the squeeze. So we'll take it. We'll take the boring road up. We'll get up there pretty quick. Like today, we're flying up this road in boost. So we're gonna climb as fast as we can. We'll be climbing about 3,000 feet to get to a really fun descent with good variety. It's got some rocks, it's got some chunk, it's got some open, fast sections, it's got some tight, twisty forest turns. Anyway, so let's get to the frame and how that affects the ride quality. This frame has 160 or 165 mils of travel paired with a 170 mil fork. So this bike is really intended to be more of an enduro bike, longer travel for gnarlier descents. It's got a pretty raked out head tube. I think they have it listed at 64, but we've measured it and it comes in closer to 63 actually. So you've got a raked out head tube and a chainstay that is 455, so on the longer side. And the wheels on this bike are a mixed wheel setup, so you got a 29 front, 27.5 rear, and all of that stacks up to a bike that is on paper built to handle downhill trails really well. The other part of the frame ride quality is the suspension design that Giant uses. They call it their Maestro suspension. And this bike feels like, with that suspension design for the rear of this bike, it feels like the bike has more travel than it does. And then another great thing about the Maestro suspension is that when you're going over like small bumps and rocks, like we've been climbing up on this fire road, there's right now it's super smooth, but as we've been coming up, there's been a lot of just chunky sections. And on an e-bike, when you can climb a lot faster than you normally would on a regular bike, man, those rough sections of uphill can kind of wear on you. But on this Maestro suspension, it just eats it right up. Now, I will also speak to technical uphill on this bike with this suspension design. With the longer chainstay, it can be a little harder to get around corners, tight corners, or tight maneuvers, switchbacks, things like that on the trail. But because it is such a soft suspension design, it gives you tons of traction. So climbing up technical sections of trail, whether it's loose or rocky and ledgy, the bike really gives you tons of traction, which is another great thing on an e-bike, because sometimes when you're in the higher power settings, you can find that the rear wheel tends to be the limiting factor on climbs, where you've got the power, you've got the line, but maybe that rear wheel isn't hooking up quite as well as you'd like, and you end up spinning out and losing your line or not being able to make it up. I've really enjoyed all kinds of climbing on this bike, both smooth and technical, and kind of these rough little fire roads like this. One of the things that I've noticed that I found as a drawback compared to some other bikes is that the front of this bike, seems to be a little heavy when you need to lift it up on ledges or manual up over things, and just manualing in general. It's a little bit more of a chore to lift the front end of the bike. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on kind of the motor and the climbing abilities of this bike. We'll get on to the components here. The particular model that we've got is spec'd with a Zeb fork, which is absolutely phenomenal. It soaks up stuff and handles pretty much anything you want to throw at it. You can get on and see all kinds of reviews about the Zeb, but it is a phenomenal piece of equipment to have on your bike, especially on a bike like this, where you're going to be very capable to head down some nasty chunky terrain. The shock, however, on this bike is the Float X, which when I first saw, I was a little curious to see how it would handle some of the stuff and terrain that this bike can ride. And while I would prefer a more downhill oriented shock, I do think that because of the Maestro suspension design, I didn't find that this shock really held the bike up or held the bike back in too many settings. You could tell occasionally on long chunky descents that, you know, after a while you would, you know, if you hit something that was square edged and the shock had gotten pretty warm, that it might get hung up. But I will say I'm not 100% sure whether that's the fault of the shock or the axle path of the rear wheel. So this particular suspension design has a more forward rotating rear axle path than some other bikes, which sometimes can lend to the bike getting hung up on square edged hits after you're already into, you know, the mid to lower portion of the travel. So if you're taking repeated hits and the suspension's packing up a little bit and then you hit a square edge, sometimes you'll feel that. So I'm not sure if that's, again, due to the shock getting a little overheated and not being able to handle some of those quick hits, or if it's just the axle path, and who knows. But overall, the quality of ride downhill on this bike is great. So this bike has been spec'd with the SRAM GX mechanical drivetrain, which is a workhorse, 12 speeds. It's not going to break the bank. You don't have to worry about additional batteries, things like that. I really do like the GX drivetrain. And then rounding things out, the brakes are Code RS, which I find the Code brakes can be a little spongy if you're if you don't get them bled at the right intervals. But when they're bled properly, I really like these brakes. They've got great modulation, and of course brakes are, like a lot of people say, they are a very personal type preference component. When I first started riding SRAM brakes, I hated them. The more I rode them, the more I grew to appreciate the modulation they provide versus a brake like Shimano or some others. So anyway, so we're up here, up on the crest already. We've climbed up about 5 miles or so. We'll check in with you here in a minute. We'll get to the descending portion of this ride. All right, kind of at the junction here where the trail meets up with another trail that we're gonna head down on, and right here at the top, this part's kind of slow and loose, chunky. And man, I've ridden this section on a lot of different bikes, and this one so far has handled that the best. Not a surprise. With all the chunky tech trails we have in southern Utah, I've been able to kind of put this bike through its paces on some of that stuff, and whew, got a little loose there. And yeah, it really, like, it almost, like some of the sections of technical trail, say, I mean, the bike just smooths them out so much that you carry so much more speed. One thing we didn't talk about on the ride quality spec portion on this bike is the tires that it comes with. And it's a 2.5 front and rear width. The front is a Maxxis DHR with EXO Plus casing, which I don't know, I think it's fine for a lot of things, but with how capable this bike is, it could definitely use a double down in the front. And in the rear, it's kind of got an interesting tire. It's a high roller, again, 2.5 inch width, high roller, and double down casing. Which the high roller is a pretty fast rolling tire. So if you're really wanting like the max amount of traction, you might want to go with something different there. But I've found that with the high roller in that double down casing, it's held up really well. Now, a lot of that's kind of personal preference with tires, but I have found that they worked really well right out of the box. So downhill performance on this bike, honestly, it just makes you want to go fast. I mean, coming down that technical section that we were just on, just loose and rough, I just kind of wish I was wearing pads and a full face, because I would like to see how much faster I could ride that, because I know the bike could handle it. It's just like the faster you go on this bike, the better it gets. So here in a little bit, we're gonna hit some more flowy sections of downhill, and I'll let you know my thoughts when we get there. Okay, so far, coming down like the more flowy, smoother parts of this trail, I was wondering if the bike would kind of hold me back a little bit in turns and corners and whatnot. And I've really found that going downhill on this bike, like it does well on just about every type of terrain. And even though it is a little bit of a longer bike as far as wheelbase and chainstay go, I think the fact that the bike comes spec'd as a mixed wheel with a 27.5 rear really helps the maneuverability and keeps the bike stable at high speeds at the same time. It feels really balanced actually from front to back. Where I have found that there is a bit of a negative is on some of the tighter climbing sections. And it's not awful, but it doesn't do as well as some shorter bikes that we've tested, or at least some bikes with shorter chainstays. This trail is notorious for being pretty loose with a lot of that kitty litter type gravel, especially later in the summer like it is here. And a lot of times those corners can be a little bit sketchy coming on, depending on the type of bike you're on and the tires. And I've been able to get some really good grip with these tires and these brakes and kind of the bike in general. Haven't really had a hard time getting the bike leaned over when I've wanted to in the turns. I've always really liked Maxxis tires as well, like a lot of people. They seem to give you a lot of grip when you get on the edges. But yeah, overall, man, this bike just wants to, just like, it makes you feel like you want to go faster. So fun. Oh.
Okay, you just had a nice long ride with Bryce out on the trail, so let me give you some quick hitting points to sum up our team's impression of the overall ride quality here. This thing is pure enduro. It's just wicked fun to ride downhill, and if we had more time with it, we'd probably further push its limits because it doesn't feel like we've found them yet. The flip chip is pretty nice. Bryce did that ride with a bit more slack, while Justin and I rode it a bit more with steeper head angle, and it provides a nice change to make your bike feel more versatile when needs call for something a bit more responsive in tighter environments. The comfort was terrific. It's always interesting to test the same components on a different frame. The Zeb has always felt good to me, but it felt fantastic on this bike with the frame's Geo and the Maestro linkage and Float X suspension. Now, speaking of the linkage, Bryce mentioned how the chainstay length was longer, which gives it nice downhill stability, and when you compress that Maestro 4-bar linkage, it actually further elongates your wheelbase. We think that's one of the reasons we like the feel of this bike when pointed downhill. Overall, it's just a great system. The drivetrain, brakes, and tires will largely boil down to personal preference, but it all felt like good total value for the package you're getting. They all performed well in the desert and mountain trails that we rode. So it's the end of the review and it's scorecard time. What does the Rain do well and what do we wish we could change? The highlights for us was how it felt going downhill and off jumps. It is just smooth as butter and it seemed like the faster you go, the better it gets. Just point that thing downhill and go. A lot of that can be attributed to the suspension system. The Zeb fork and Fox float system on Giant's Maestro linkage felt terrific, so it was just a lot of fun flying downhill. The motor on this bike has the power you need. It shines with the power you get in low cadence settings, but overall it will help you a lot on the trails and just a lot in general. One of the few drawbacks we encountered was the weight of the front end. You didn't notice the bike's weight too much unless pulling it up quickly over a large rock or root while climbing. We wouldn't mind a different set of power control buttons. These were a bit tricky to mash the right button on the fly. Overall, this is just a solid top to bottom ride though. If you're looking for an enduro bike, it's worth checking out. Make sure to leave us any questions in the comment section on what you want to know more about the Giant Rain. I'm Griffin with Electric Bike Report, and I'll see you on the next ride.